The cabin at Blackfir Lake. The first rule my uncle ever taught me about the woods around Blackfir Lake was this. If you hear your name called after dark, and you're not 100% certain of exactly who's calling it, you do not answer, and you do not go looking. I was 11 years old when he told me that, and I laughed because it sounded like the kind of thing uncles say to keep kids from wandering off at night. A scary story with a practical purpose, nothing more. I am 34 years old now, and I have not laughed at that rule once in the 9 years since the weekend it stopped being a story and became the only reason I am alive to tell you about it. My name is Wes Calloway. My family has owned a cabin on the north shore of Blackfir Lake for 3 generations. A 2-bedroom structure my grandfather built himself in the 1960s. 40 minutes past the last town with a gas station. Another 20 minutes of dirt road. Past that to reach the lake itself, deep enough into the state forest that we lost cell signal a full 10 miles before the driveway. I'd spent every summer of my childhood there, and I thought I knew those woods as well as I knew my own house. Every trail, every deer stand, every spot along the shoreline where the fishing was worth the walk. I want you to hold on to that confidence for a moment because it's going to matter later when I tell you how absolutely, those same woods stopped making sense to me in the space of about 6 hours on a weekend that was supposed to be nothing more than a quiet retreat with my 2 closest friends before my wedding. A low-key send-off before the wedding, adjacent chaos, 3 grown men with a case of beer and a fishing rod each, camping the way we had a dozen times before at that exact cabin without incident. I should tell you a little more about that history before I get to the weekend itself, because I didn't take it seriously enough at the time, and I think part of why I didn't is that my uncle told these stories the way most families tell campfire stories, with enough humor and theater woven through them that it was easy, as a kid, to file them next to ghost stories about hook-handed men and never think about them again in daylight. It was only afterward, going back through what he'd actually said over the years, piecing it together the way you'd piece together a warning you'd ignored, that I understood how carefully, how deliberately consistent his version of events had always been, even dressed up in a scary story voice for an 11-year-old. The hunter he mentioned, the one gone 11 days and found calm, unharmed, insisting his dead brother had kept him company, was a real person, a man named Elias Renner. And I confirmed the broad outline of that story years later, through an old newspaper clipping my aunt still had in a box of family keepsakes dated 1961, reporting on the search and the man's eventual, miraculous recovery, in language that carefully avoided repeating anything he'd actually said about his brother, mentioning only that he'd been found in good health despite the ordeal, and unable to fully account for his time in the wilderness. My uncle told me once, off the record of that newspaper's careful language, that Elias Renner had never been the same afterward, that he'd spent the rest of his life refusing to go anywhere near woods of any kind, that he'd moved to a city 400 miles away, specifically because it had no forest within a day's drive, and that he'd died, decades later, still occasionally telling anyone who'd listen that his brother's voice, when he closed his eyes at night, was the last thing he ever wanted to hear again. There were other stories too, less documented, passed down the way local folklore usually is, a fragmentary, half-believed patchwork of things that happened to someone's cousin or someone's grandfather's hunting partner, all of them following the same basic shape, a familiar voice calling from an impossible direction, and a person who either resisted the pull and made it out shaken but alive, or who answered and simply wasn't there anymore when anyone came looking. My uncle claimed the local search and rescue volunteers, going back generations, had an unspoken understanding about the forest around Blackfir Lake that they never stated explicitly in any official report, but which shaped subtly how seriously and how quickly they responded to anyone reported missing in that specific stretch of woods, and how grimly, privately, they'd talk about the odds once enough time had passed. I didn't think about any of that on the drive out for the bachelor party weekend. I thought about beer and fishing and how good it would feel to have one uncomplicated weekend with my two best friends before the wedding took over every remaining free hour of my life. That's the thing about warnings passed down as bedtime stories. They live in a part of your memory that doesn't activate on command. It takes something specific, something undeniable, to drag them back up into the part of your mind that actually makes decisions. And by the time that happened for me, we were already 2 hours deep into a trail that had stopped behaving like a trail. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late September myself, my friend Marcus, and my friend Tyler, who I'd known since college and who had, notably, never been camping in his life before that weekend. A fact that would matter more than any of us understood at the time. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it, a little more weathered, the dock a little more in need of repair, but fundamentally unchanged. The same knotty pine paneling, the same wood stove, the same faded photograph of my grandfather standing in front of the half-finished structure in 1967 that had hung on the same nail in the same spot my entire life. We spent the first afternoon doing exactly what you'd expect: unloading the truck, getting the generator running, fishing off the dock until the lights started to go gold and then gray. It was a good afternoon. I want that on the record, because everything that came after it makes it easy to forget that the weekend started the way every good weekend at that cabin had ever started. Unremarkable, easy, the specific, unhurried boredom of three friends with nothing to do but exist together in a beautiful place. The first strange thing happened around 9 that night while we were sitting around the fire pit, a short walk from the cabin, and it was small enough that none of us thought much of it in the moment. Tyler stood up abruptly, mid-conversation, and turned to look back toward the tree line behind the cabin, his expression shifting from relaxed to uncertain in the space of a single second. "Did one of you just call my name?" Marcus and I both said no, and Tyler shrugged, said it must have been the wind or his imagination, and sat back down, and the conversation moved on within a minute, the way these things do, the way they're supposed to, the way I've since learned they're specifically designed to. It happened again around 11, this time to Marcus, and this time all three of us heard something. Not clearly enough to identify as anyone's actual voice, but present enough that all three of us stopped talking at the same moment and turned toward the same stretch of dark tree line. And I remember the specific quality of that silence, thick and total. No crickets, no wind, nothing. The kind of silence that a forest makes only when something in it has decided to hold very still. "That's not the wind," Tyler said. "Might be an owl," Marcus said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. "Owls make weird calls sometimes. Sounds almost human if you don't know what you're listening for." I want to be honest that I didn't correct him, even though some old, half-forgotten part of my brain was already reaching back toward my uncle's rule, because correcting him would have meant explaining a rule that, said out loud to two grown men at a bachelor party campfire, sounded exactly as ridiculous as it had sounded to 11-year-old me. So I let it go. I told myself it was probably an owl, too. We put out the fire not long after that and went inside earlier than we'd planned. And none of us said anything about why, though I think all three of us understood, without needing to discuss it, that none of us particularly wanted to sit outside in the dark for the rest of that evening. I slept badly that first night, and I want to describe exactly what woke me, because I've turned this memory over so many times since that I trust it more than almost anything else from that weekend. The way you trust the first domino more than the ones that fell after it. I woke at some indeterminate hour, deep in the night, to the sound of someone walking on the gravel path outside the cabin, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from the direction of the lake toward the front door, stopping directly outside it. I lay there, fully awake, listening, and after a long stretch of silence, a voice spoke, quietly, from just outside the door, close enough that it should have been muffled by the wood, and wasn't. clear as if the person speaking had their mouth pressed almost against the frame. "Wes, let me in. It's cold out here." I want to tell you that I recognize the voice, because that's the detail that still, 9 years later, makes my chest go tight every time I think about it. It was my uncle's voice. The same uncle who taught me the rule about not answering. The same uncle who had died 4 years before. That weekend, of a heart attack, in a hospital 200 miles from that lake. A fact I knew with absolute certainty. Lying there in the dark, at the same moment that every fiber of my exhausted, frightened brain wanted desperately to get up and open that door. I didn't move. I don't fully know why, except that some instinct older than conscious thought held me in place. The same instinct, I think, that makes a rabbit freeze instead of run when it can't tell yet which direction the danger is coming from. The voice spoke again, a little more insistent, a little colder at the edges. "Ooh, Wes, don't be rude. Let your uncle in." I lay there for what felt like an hour and was probably closer to 10 minutes, rigid, staring at the ceiling until the footsteps finally retreated back down the gravel path, back toward the lake. And silence returned, and I did not sleep again that night. Not for one more minute, listening instead to the sound of Marcus's steady breathing from the other bed in the room and feeling, for the first time in my adult life, a fear so total it had a physical weight, sitting on my chest like something with actual mass. I told Marcus and Tyler about it over coffee the next morning, expecting, honestly, that they'd tell me I'd dreamed it, and half hoping they would, because a dream was a much better explanation than the alternative. Instead, Tyler went very quiet and then admitted that he'd heard something too. A voice, calling his name from just outside his window. A voice he didn't recognize because, unlike me, he had no dead relative whose voice it could have been mimicking, which somehow made it worse rather than better, hearing it described. Marcus hadn't heard anything, and he made the observation, cautiously, that maybe it was some kind of local wildlife phenomenon we didn't know about. "Foxes make eerie calls," he said, Googling on his phone, before remembering we had no signal. Some birds mimic sounds. Maybe there was something about the acoustics of the lake at night that distorted animal calls into something that sounded, to a half-asleep brain, like a human voice saying a name. I wanted to believe him. I want to tell you that clearly, because I think it's important to understand that none of us, even after that first night, were eager to believe the worst explanation available. We are, all three of us, ordinary, rational men, and rational men reach for foxes and owls and acoustic phenomena long before they reach for anything else. And I think that instinct, that reasonable human reluctance to believe in something impossible, is exactly what nearly got us killed. We decided to hike out to a ridge about 2 hours from the cabin that Marcus remembered fondly from a trip years earlier. A decision that, in hindsight, feels like exactly the kind of ordinary, unremarkable choice that these things wait for. Not a decision made under duress. Not a moment of panic, just 3 friends deciding to go for a hike on a clear Saturday afternoon. The kind of decision that shouldn't matter at all, and mattered more than any other choice we made that entire weekend. The trail was well marked for the first hour, the same trail I'd hiked a dozen times as a teenager, and I want to walk you through exactly how it stopped being that trail, because the transition was so gradual that none of us noticed it happening until it had already happened completely. It started with small things. A fork in the trail that I didn't remember being there, though I told myself trails change over the years, erosion and deadfall reroute things, nothing unusual about that. Then a second fork sooner than the first should have allowed given how far we'd walked. Then a boulder formation that Marcus swore he remembered clearly from his previous trip, positioned in a spot that, according to the trail markers, we shouldn't have reached for another 40 minutes. I think we took a wrong turn somewhere, I said, checking my phone for the useless comfort of a map app that had nothing to load without signal. We didn't take a wrong turn.
Marcus said, and something in his voice had gone flat in a way I didn't like. There was only one trail. We didn't turn anywhere. I've been counting the markers. We had been counting the markers, small orange blazes painted on trees at intervals, standard trail marking, the same system used on every trail in that forest. And Marcus was right. We had followed every single blaze in order, and yet somehow 2 hours into what should have been a 2-hour hike to the ridge, we found ourselves standing at the edge of an unfamiliar clearing that none of us recognized, with the light beginning far too early for the actual hour on my watch to take on the flat gray quality of early evening. Tyler was the one who said it first, the thing none of us had wanted to say out loud yet. "What time does your watch say?" "4:40, I said. "It's not 4:40, Tyler said. "Look at the light. That's not 4:40 light. That's like 7 o'clock light."
We stood in that clearing for a long moment, all three of us looking at our respective phones and watches, all of them agreeing with each other, all of them clearly, obviously wrong given the actual position of the sun sinking toward a horizon. It had no business approaching for another 2.5 hours.
"We need to turn around," I said. "Now. Follow the blazes back exactly the way we came."
We tried. I want to be completely clear about this because it's the detail that convinced me more than anything else that weekend that we were dealing with something that had actively, intelligently decided to keep us in those woods. We followed the orange blazes back in the exact reverse order we'd followed them coming out, counting them the way Marcus had counted them on the way in. And after 40 minutes of walking, we arrived not at the trailhead, not at any point closer to the cabin, but back at the exact same unfamiliar clearing we just left.
"That's not possible," Marcus said, and I watched something in his composure crack for the first time that weekend. A thin hairline fracture in a man I'd always known to be steady under pressure. We walked in a straight line. We followed the same markers. We can't have ended up back here. The light had gone from gray to something closer to true dusk by then, though my watch still insisted it was barely 5 in the afternoon. And somewhere behind us, from the direction we'd just come from, a voice called out, clear and warm and utterly, horribly familiar. "Wes, over here, buddy. You're going the wrong way." It was my uncle's voice again. The same voice from outside the cabin door the night before, and I felt every hair on my body rise at once, because that voice was coming from a direction none of us had walked, from deeper in the trees, from a spot that, according to everything we understood about the terrain, shouldn't have had a clear line of sight to where we were standing at all. "Don't," I said, before either Marcus or Tyler could respond, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Don't answer it. Don't go toward it. That's not a person." "Wes, what the hell are you talking about?" Tyler said, though he'd gone pale and I could see, even in the failing light, that some part of him already believed me, was already ahead of his own rational objections. I told them, right there in that clearing, everything my uncle had told me at 11 years old about the rule of Blackfir Lake, that the woods around the lake had a history, older than my family's ownership of the cabin, of hikers going missing, of hunters returning with stories about voices calling their names from directions that made no sense, of at least 2 documented disappearances, decades apart, where searchers had found absolutely nothing, no remains, no gear, no trace, as though the person had simply stepped sideways out of the world. My uncle had grown up in the area, had heard the stories from old-timers who'd heard them from older old-timers still, and the rule he'd given me, the only rule, repeated every single summer of my childhood, with a seriousness that had always slightly embarrassed me, was simple and absolute. If you hear your name in these woods after the light starts to go strange, you do not answer, you do not go toward it, and you do not, under any circumstances, trust a voice just because it sounds like someone you love. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked, and I could hear, underneath the fear, a genuine question, an actual need for me to have an answer because I was, in that moment, the only one of us with any framework at all for understanding what was happening. "We find water," I said, remembering, suddenly, another fragment of my uncle's rule that I hadn't thought about in years. He always said, if you get lost out here, don't try to find the trail. Find the lake. Water doesn't move. Trails can be. I don't know, trails can apparently move, or seem to, or whatever the hell is happening to us right now, but water finds the lowest point and stays there. If we find the shoreline, we can follow it back to the cabin no matter what the trail's doing. We started walking, all three of us, in the direction that felt most like downhill, away from the voice, which called out twice more as we moved, each time from a slightly different direction, each time in a tone that shifted almost imperceptibly, from warm to wounded, my uncle's voice taking on, by the third call, an edge of genuine hurt. "Wes, why are you running from me? I just want to see you before the wedding."
I want to tell you how badly that specific detail, before the wedding, information a random forest phenomenon should have had no way of knowing. Information that meant whatever was calling in that voice had access to something true
About my actual life, nearly broke my resolve not to answer. I kept walking. I kept my eyes on the ground, on the slight downward slope that I was trusting with everything I had. And I did not look back toward the voice even once, though I could feel,
with a certainty that had nothing to do with hearing or seeing anything specific, that something was moving through the trees parallel to us, matching our pace, patient, unhurried, the way a predator moves when it isn't worried yet about losing its prey.
The forest around us had changed by then, in ways that were harder to attribute to failing light or simple disorientation. The trees themselves seemed wrong. Not different trees exactly, but arranged with a strange, deliberate irregularity. Gaps in the canopy that let through a colorless, directionless illumination that didn't match any point in an actual sunset. Shadows that fell at angles inconsistent with each other, as though more than one light source existed, and none of them were the actual sun. Tyler was the one who started to lose his composure fully. Somewhere in the second hour of that walk, his breathing gone ragged, his pace faltering, and I understood, watching him, that a man with no prior camping experience, dropped into something this far outside any normal frame of reference, was going to break before Marcus or I did, and that whatever happened to him next was going to determine what happened to the rest of us. "I can't do this," he said, stopping dead in the middle of a stride. "I can't. Wes, I need to stop for a second. I need to just breathe." "You can't stop," I said, grabbing his arm, harder than I meant to. "If you stop, it catches up. I don't know how I know that, but I know it. We have to keep moving toward the water." What if there is no water? What if we're just walking in circles the same way we were with the trail markers? I didn't have an answer for that. And I think Tyler could see that I didn't. And I watched something in his face shift toward a kind of surrender that terrified me more than anything the forest itself had done. Because I understood, in that moment, that the real danger wasn't the voice calling from the trees. The real danger was watching one of my closest friends decide, quietly, in the space of a few seconds, that answering the voice might be easier than continuing to fight it. Don't, I said again, softer this time, closer to a plea. "Tyler, look at me. Whatever it says, whoever it sounds like, it is not going to lead you anywhere you want to go. My uncle told me that when he was a kid, a hunter from town went missing out here for 11 days, and when they finally found him, he was 12 miles from where he'd started, sitting calmly against a tree, completely unharmed. No injuries, no signs of exposure, despite 11 days in the wilderness, in October. And he told the search party, completely calm, completely lucid, that his brother had been keeping him company the whole time, bringing him food, telling him where to walk to stay safe. His brother had been dead for 6 years. Tyler stared at me for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. And we kept walking. And I want to tell you that this is the point in the story where things got better, where finding that resolve turned the tide, and I can't because it isn't true. Things got considerably worse before they got any better at all. We heard the voice change tactics somewhere in the 3rd hour, shifting away from my uncle and towards something that made my stomach drop in an entirely different way. A woman's voice, calling out, panicked in a tone that sounded genuinely, urgently in distress. The specific cadence of someone actually hurt and actually calling for help rather than someone performing a lure. "Please, somebody, I fell. I think my leg is broken. Please, I can hear you out there. Please don't leave me." Marcus stopped walking immediately, his whole body turning toward the sound with an expression of pure, uncomplicated compassion. The exact reaction any decent person would have to what sounded, in every detail, like a real woman in real danger. And I understood, watching him, that the voice had learned something specific about each of us over the course of that night. That it had tried my dead uncle on me because I would recognize and trust that voice. Tried my friend's name on Tyler, in a register he wouldn't immediately question, and was now trying, on Marcus, the one lure most likely to override a good man's rational fear. A stranger in genuine need, someone he could actually, meaningfully, help. "That could be real," Marcus said. "Wes, what if that's an actual person? What if we walk away and there's an actual hiker out there with a broken leg and we just left her?" "There's no hiker," I said, though I understood exactly how monstrous it sounded to say that with such certainty about a voice that sounded, in every respect, like someone in genuine pain. "Marcus, think about what's happened tonight. Trails that loop back on themselves. Light that doesn't match the clock. My dead uncle's voice, knowing details about my wedding it has no way of knowing. This is the same thing. Wearing a different voice, and if you walk toward it, I don't think you're coming back. And if you're wrong, if there's an actual person out there and we just left her to die because of some story your uncle told you as a kid, I didn't have a way to prove I was right, and I watched Marcus start to move. One slow step in the direction of the crying voice, and I understood that I was about to lose him, that no argument I had was going to outweigh a fundamentally decent man's need to help someone who sounded like she was dying, and in the half second before I would have had to physically restrain him, the voice made a mistake. The only mistake it made that entire night, and it was the thing that saved all 3 of us. It called out again, closer this time, and in the middle of the panicked, pained cadence, for just a fraction of a second. The pitch dropped, wrong, into something that wasn't quite a woman's voice anymore, an overlapping doubled quality, as though 2 things were speaking at once and hadn't quite finished synchronizing, and the words that came out, garbled at the edges, were not, "Please help me." They were, as clearly as I have ever heard anything in my life, 3 words that had nothing to do with a woman with a broken leg at all. Almost got him. Marcus stopped moving. I watched the exact moment the spell broke on his face, the specific horror of realizing how close he'd come, and none of us said a word. We just turned, all 3 of us, and started walking as fast as we could in the opposite direction, away from the voice, away from the sound that had already gone back to its panicked, pleading cadence behind us, calling out with renewed, more desperate urgency, as though it understood it had lost its opening and was scrambling to get it back. We found the lake about 40 minutes later. I have never in my life felt anything like the relief of seeing that flat, dark expanse of water through the trees, and I have never moved faster in my life than I moved in the last quarter mile along that shoreline. Both my friends right behind me, None of us speaking, all of us simply running in the dark along a shore we didn't fully recognize until the cabin's outline finally rose up out of the trees ahead of us, lights still on inside from when we'd left that morning. The most beautiful, ordinary sight I have ever seen. We didn't sleep. We sat up all night with every light in that cabin on, the wood stove roaring, none of us saying much of anything, until the sun actually rose. The real sun, at the real time, 7 hours after my watch had insisted evening had already fallen. And by the time it did, we had already decided, without needing to discuss it, that we were leaving that morning. Wedding preparations be damned, 3 days early, and that none of us was ever setting foot on a trail near Blackfir Lake again as long as we lived. We didn't talk about that night again, the three of us together, for almost 2 years. It wasn't an agreement so much as an avoidance that none of us ever had to negotiate out loud. Every time the subject drifted anywhere close to it, at the wedding, at the barbecues and holidays that followed, one of us would find a way to steer the conversation somewhere else, and the other two would follow gratefully, relieved not to have to be the one who brought it up first. It was Tyler, eventually, who broke that unspoken rule, calling me late one night almost 2 years after the bachelor party, his voice tight in a way I recognized immediately, the specific tightness of someone who's been sitting with something alone for too long and has finally run out of room to keep holding it by himself. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to not think I'm losing it." He told me that he'd started, over the previous several months, hearing a voice sometimes, late at night, in his own apartment, 400 miles from Blackfir Lake. Not often, maybe 5 or 6 times total since it started. Always in the same register the forest voice had used on him that night, always calling his name in a tone just affectionate enough to make him hesitate for a half second before he caught himself. He said it had gotten worse, rather than better over time, more frequent, and that he'd started sleeping with a white noise machine running constantly. Not because it helped exactly, but because the sound gave him something to focus on, besides listening for whether the voice was going to come again. "Do you think it followed you home?" I asked him. And I remember how much I didn't want to ask that question, because some part of me had spent 2 years telling myself that whatever happened at Blackfir Lake was contained there, a property of that specific stretch of woods, something we could leave behind completely once we crossed back over the county line. "I don't know," Tyler said. "I don't know if it followed me, or if it just left something behind in me that it can still find whenever it wants to check in. I don't know which one of those is worse, honestly. I just know I answered it. Once, about 3 weeks ago. I was half asleep and it called my name and I said, 'Yeah,' before I even knew what I was doing, out loud in my own bedroom, and nothing happened afterward. Nothing that I noticed anyway. But I haven't been able to shake the feeling since then that I opened a door I don't know how to close again." I didn't have anything useful to tell him. Marcus, when I called him afterward to ask if he'd experienced anything similar, went quiet for a long moment before admitting, reluctantly, that he'd had a handful of dreams over the 2 years since that weekend. Always the same basic shape. Standing in an unfamiliar clearing, hearing a woman crying for help just out of sight. Walking toward the sound despite knowing, even inside the dream, exactly what he was walking toward. Dreams he always woke from at the same moment, just before he reached whatever was making the sound, his heart going so hard he could feel it in his teeth.
None of us has ever been able to explain why some of it seems to have stayed with us or why it seems to have settled more heavily on Tyler than on Marcus or me. Though I have a theory I've never said out loud to either of them because it feels cruel to say and I don't actually know if it's true. I think it settled hardest on the one of us who came closest to answering out loud, and I think Marcus's near miss in that clearing, catching himself half a step from walking toward that voice, left a lighter mark than Tyler's, whispered, "Yeah?" into the dark of his own bedroom,
3 weeks before that phone call, 400 miles from those woods in a place none of us had ever thought to consider unsafe. My uncle's cabin still stands on that shore. My family hasn't sold it, mostly because none of us can agree on what to do with it, and none of us wants to be the one to go back out there long enough to deal with a realtor. It sits empty most of the year now, and I think about it sometimes alone out there at the edge of those woods, and I think about how many other families over the decades have heard a familiar voice call out from the tree line after dark and made the choice, in a moment of love or grief or simple decency, to answer it. I asked my uncle, once, years before that weekend, why he thought the woods did that, called out in the voices of people you loved, people who were gone. I don't know why I never told you this detail sooner. It feels now like the single most important thing he ever said to me, and I wish I'd understood, at 11 years old, exactly how literally I was meant to take it. It's not trying to trick you into thinking they're really there, he said. It's smarter than that. It just wants you close enough to reach. Everything else is just about finding the voice that gets you close enough.
I didn't understand what he meant back then. I understand it now, and it is the reason I have not been fishing or camping or hiking in any forest deep enough to lose a cell signal in the 9 years since that weekend. And it is the reason that if you ever find yourself somewhere remote enough that the trail markers stop making sense and the light starts behaving strangely and you hear someone you love calling your name from a direction that shouldn't be possible, I am asking you, as directly and seriously as I have ever asked anyone anything, do not answer. Do not go toward it. Find the water and follow it, and do not stop moving until you reach a light that you built yourself. Some things in those woods have gotten very good over a very long time, and sounding like the people who love you. The only defense that has ever worked, as far as I know, is refusing to answer at all, no matter how much it hurts, no matter how real it sounds, no matter how certain you become. In the moment that the voice calling to you from the dark could not possibly be anything other than exactly who it claims to be.